At 60, the man who once terrified millions as Norman Bates died with a secret that Hollywood never dared to speak. He had it all: the fame, the face, the Oscar nominations. And yet, he was trapped inside a life carefully scripted by studios, by fear, and by a society that told him, don't you dare be yourself. Anthony Perkins wasn't just an actor. He was a symbol of repression, of duality, of a life lived in the shadows. On screen, he played murderers and madmen. Off screen, he lived in fear of exposure, terrified that if the world ever discovered who he truly loved, it would all be over. He married a beautiful woman, had 2 sons. The press called it a fairy tale. But it wasn't love, it was cover. Because years earlier, Anthony had already given his heart away to a man, a fellow actor, a secret that would cost him everything if it ever got out. For decades, the truth stayed buried, hidden behind studio deals, fake interviews, and cold, silent nights. Even as AIDS ravaged the industry, Anthony stayed quiet until his own diagnosis forced him to confront the life he had never truly lived. So what really happened? Why did he marry someone he barely knew? What was in the letter he never sent? And who was the man that haunted him to the very end? This is the story of Anthony Perkins, the heartthrob who couldn't love out loud. Anthony Perkins was born on April 4th, 1932 in New York City, but from the moment he entered the world, he was already a shadow of someone else. His father, Osgood Perkins, was a successful Broadway and film actor, known for his intensity and aristocratic bearing. To the outside world, the Perkins name carried prestige, but to young Anthony, it carried absence. Osgood was rarely home. He was either performing or traveling, caught in the high of a career that demanded presence elsewhere. When he did return, he brought with him a cold, almost theatrical demeanor, more director than dad. Anthony once described his father as someone always watching from a distance, never touching. That distance left a scar. Worse still, Osgood died suddenly of a heart attack when Anthony was just 5 years old. One moment, he had a father he barely knew; the next, he had a ghost. And in that ghost shadow, Anthony began building a persona of his own, one shaped by grief, abandonment, and a gnawing fear of never being good enough. His mother, Janet Esselstyn, was left to raise him alone. But she didn't nurture him, she consumed him. Overprotective to the point of suffocation. Janet blurred the boundaries between mother and son. She would brush his hair, stroke his face, tuck him into bed long past the age most boys wanted that. Psychologists would later suggest there was emotional enmeshment, even subtle manipulation. Anthony grew up torn between guilt and obligation, unable to form healthy emotional attachments. As a child, he stuttered badly, words caught in his throat, his voice unsure, as if he were always holding something back. Teachers labeled him shy. Other boys called him mama's boy. Deep down, Anthony was terrified of rejection, of judgment, of being different. And even then, he knew he was different. By age 11, Anthony had begun to sense the stirrings of attraction, but they weren't for girls. He couldn't say it out loud. Not in the 1940s, not in a world where men were supposed to be strong, straight, silent. So he buried it, the first of many secrets he would lock away. They moved off in Boston, then New York, then out to Massachusetts. Anthony never had a place to call home, never stayed long enough to build lasting friendships. Instead, he turned to movies. The flickering images on the screen gave him comfort. In those dark theaters, he could become anyone. He could be heroic, dangerous, desired. He found refuge in acting early on: school plays, community theater. It was the one place he didn't stutter. On stage, behind a mask, he could speak freely. It was as if the characters were a shield, and behind them, Anthony could hide in plain sight. At Columbia University and later Rollins College, he studied drama seriously, honing his craft with a quiet, simmering intensity. But even as he built his skill, he remained emotionally closed off. Friends would later recall how guarded he was, how he never spoke about dating, never shared intimate details. Some sensed the loneliness beneath his polite exterior. But no one dared ask. In his early 20s, he moved to Hollywood, a town that promised dreams but demanded silence. He arrived with talent, tall and slender, with soft brown eyes that could shift from innocence to menace in a second. He was different, and the studios noticed. He looked like a leading man, but had the soul of a character actor. And in a post-war America hungry for new kinds of male stars, Anthony was both fresh and mysterious. But he was still hiding, still carrying that little boy inside, the one who'd lost his father, clung to his mother, buried his truth, and learned that love was something dangerous. Before Anthony Perkins became Norman Bates, before he haunted our screens with his quiet madness, he was just a frightened boy trying to become the man everyone wanted him to be. Anthony Perkins didn't explode onto the Hollywood scene. He slipped in quietly, almost like a secret. At just 23, he landed his first major film role in The Actress, 1953, opposite Spencer Tracy. He was tall, awkward, with a nervous charm that set him apart from the chiseled, alpha male stars of the era. In a town full of Marlboro men, Anthony was something else entirely: vulnerable, cerebral, unknowable, and audiences couldn't look away. The 1950s was a decade of contradictions. America was booming, suburbanizing, pretending that everything was perfect. But under that polished surface, people were hungry for something more real, and Anthony Perkins offered exactly that. He wasn't threatening, he didn't dominate, he invited empathy, and Hollywood saw potential. His big break came in 1956 when he starred in Friendly Persuasion as the sensitive, peace-loving son of a Quaker family. The role earned him an Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actor, and more importantly, it gave him an identity. The critics labeled him the new James Dean. Though he lacked Dean's rage, Anthony wasn't rebellious. He was romantic, soft-spoken, haunted. Women adored him. Men didn't quite know what to make of him. But inside, Anthony was still pretending. He knew he couldn't let anyone too close, not romantically, not emotionally, so he kept his distance, focusing on work, pushing himself to meet the expectations of a studio system that had strict rules about what kind of man a leading man was allowed to be. Behind the scenes, the real Anthony began to surface in coded ways. He formed intense, often secretive friendships with other men artists, actors, stylists. One of the most important relationships of his early years was with Tab Hunter, a fellow heartthrob. The two were inseparable for a time, laughing, traveling, spending long evenings in whispered conversation. But their connection was dangerous. Studios warned both men to cut ties. Tab, who would later come out publicly, described their relationship as a beautiful but impossible thing to maintain his image. Anthony was often paired with actresses for publicity, studio-arranged dates, photo ops, tabloid flings, none of them real. Behind every smile was a contract. Behind every story, a lie. It was the 1950s. After all, a single gay rumor could destroy a career overnight. Still, he kept working. In 1957, he starred in Fear Strikes Out, playing real-life baseball player Jimmy Pearsall, who struggled with mental illness. The performance was raw, intense, and unsettling. Audiences saw a man unraveling on screen. They didn't realize they were also watching a man unraveling off screen. Anthony later admitted that he identified deeply with the character's internal torment. He was gaining a reputation not just as a matinee idol, but as an actor with depth, willing to explore the darker corners of the human mind. Yet the irony was painful. He was becoming famous for portraying madness and repression, while secretly battling his own. Then came Alfred Hitchcock. In 1960, Anthony was cast in Psycho, the role that would define, and in many ways, destroy him. As Norman Bates, he delivered a performance so chilling, so layered, that it permanently changed the face of horror cinema. He wasn't a monster in the traditional sense. He was boyish, lonely, polite until he wasn't. That complexity made the character unforgettable, and it blurred the line between actor and role in the public's mind. Psycho was a phenomenon, a cultural earthquake. It shattered box office records and pushed the boundaries of what was acceptable on screen. Anthony became a global icon, but behind the fame, he was frightened. He once said, "Oh, I hate men. Norman was too much like me for comfort." For most, Psycho was a peak. For Anthony, it was a trap. Directors began to typecast him always the fragile man, the hidden threat, the outsider. Offers came in, but they were variations of the same role. He was being reduced to a symbol of something he didn't fully understand, yet lived every day. He tried to resist the pigeonhole, took roles in Europe, directed theater, recorded albums. But no matter what he did, Norman Bates followed him. Audiences didn't want Anthony Perkins. They wanted the twisted boy with the knife and the wig. And the more he tried to escape that shadow, the more it consumed him. Still, he smiled for the cameras. Still, he said all the right things. But the mask was beginning to slip. By the early 1960s, Anthony Perkins was a household name, but not the kind that invited comfort. He wasn't the suave Cary Grant or the rugged Paul Newman. He was something else, something harder to define, and even harder to trust. On the surface, he was the charming, boyish star who had taken Hollywood by storm. But underneath, he had become an enigma, and that mystery was both his weapon and his curse. After Psycho, Anthony's fame exploded. The film grossed over $32 million, a staggering sum for its time. Hitchcock's gamble to cast an emotionally complex, subtly androgynous actor in a horror role paid off in ways no one predicted. Norman Bates became a cultural archetype, and Anthony Perkins, he became immortal and imprisoned. He tried to ride the wave. In Europe, he starred in stylish films like Goodbye Again, 1961, opposite Ingrid Bergman, and The Trial, 1962, directed by Orson Welles. He was adored by European directors for his intelligence and subtlety. There, he was treated like a serious actor, not just a psycho in waiting. Fashion magazines called him the thinking woman's sex symbol. He was tall and lanky, with dark, soulful eyes and a shy smile that made people lean in. He wore slim-cut suits, spoke fluent French, and moved with a quiet elegance of someone who never quite believed he belonged in the room. His look was iconic. His presence was hypnotic. But even as fans screamed his name, he was drifting further from himself. Anthony was never a playboy, but the press tried to make him one. Rumors of flings with leading ladies were carefully leaked. Publicists posed him with starlets at beach resorts, premiere parties, and photo shoots, but none of those women ever became part of his real story. Behind the camera, Anthony remained emotionally unavailable to them, and often even to his closest friends. There were whispers. There were always whispers. Some said he was gay. Others said he was just too intense for relationships, but no one could confirm anything because Anthony was a master of deflection. He knew the rules. In 1960s Hollywood, a public admission of homosexuality was career suicide. You didn't just lose roles, you were blacklisted, labeled deviant, quietly erased. And so, he hid in plain sight. He took on Broadway roles, released a pop album, and maintained a delicate balance between fame and invisibility. He was everywhere and nowhere with famous, but unknowable. It was the perfect illusion. Yet fame, once bright, began to flicker. By the late 1960s, the roles became fewer and the scripts thinner. Hollywood was changing. The new wave of cinema demanded grit, edge, vulnerability, but Anthony had already given all of that to Norman Bates. And now casting directors saw him as strange, not edgy, just odd, off, unplaceable. The very thing that once made him magnetic was now making him unemployable. Still, he tried. He returned for Psycho 2 in 1983, a surprising box office success that reignited curiosity in him. He even directed Psycho 3 in 1986, trying to put his own spin on the character who had haunted him for decades. But the damage was done, to the world. He was Norman, and by now, Part of him had given in to that identity. In interviews, he was gracious but distant. He avoided personal questions. When asked about love, he deflected. When asked about fear, he smiled. And all the while, the man behind the mask was growing weary. He had the look. He had the fame. He had the legacy. But what he didn't have and never truly found was freedom. Because at the peak of his career, Anthony Perkins wasn't living a dream. He was performing a role. And every morning, when the lights faded and the cameras turned off, he returned to a home full of silence, secrets, and loneliness. By the late 1980s, the mask Anthony Perkins had worn for most of his life began to crack, and behind it was a man slowly unraveling. He had spent decades hiding his sexuality, hiding his truth, hiding the loneliness that gnawed at him night after night. But secrets like his don't stay buried forever. Not when they come with a cut. Anthony's entire adult life had been a performance. Even his marriage was part of the act. In 1983, at the age of 41, he shocked Hollywood by marrying photographer and actress Barry Berenson. To the outside world, it looked like a happy ending. The shy bachelor had finally found love. They had two sons, Oz and Elvis. And for a time, Anthony seemed content. But insiders knew better. His marriage was less about passion and more about protection. Barry was kind, supportive, and understanding. She knew the man she married wasn't like other husbands, and perhaps she accepted that. Some believe she knew everything and stayed anyway. Others say she was left in the dark, raising their children alone while Anthony lived a double life. Because even during his marriage, Anthony continued to have relationships with men, always in secret, always with fear. He would meet lovers quietly, away from cameras, away from eyes. He lived two lives and both were tearing him apart. And then came the diagnosis. In 1990, Anthony Perkins tested positive for HIV. He didn't go public. He didn't make a statement. He didn't want sympathy. In fact, he told no one, not even his closest friends, until the disease had progressed into full-blown AIDS. He was terrified, not just of dying, but of being found out. Because in those years, AIDS wasn't just a death sentence, it was a stigma. The media treated it like a plague of shame. Actors who were outed as HIV positive were vilified. Offers disappeared. Friends vanished. Legacies were rewritten with cruelty. Anthony couldn't bear the thought, so he stayed quiet. He withdrew from the spotlight, turned down roles, skipped interviews, avoided red carpets. For a man who had already spent his life hiding in shadows, it was the final retreat. His body weakened. The tall, slender frame that once graced magazine covers grew thin and frail. He lost weight, lost color, but he kept working. Even as his health collapsed, in his final films, the spark in his eyes was still there but dimmed, exhausted, waiting. He died on September 12, 1992, at the age of 60. His death shocked the world not because he was gone, but because of how he had gone. The official announcement revealed for the first time that he had been living with AIDS. To some, it was heartbreaking. To others, it was shameful. The tabloids circled like vultures, speculating about his lovers, about his sexuality, about the things he had kept hidden. But the truth was simpler and sadder. Anthony Perkins had spent his whole life pretending to be straight, pretending to be happy, pretending to be someone he wasn't, because the world wouldn't let him be anything else. He never got to come out. He never got to live free. He never got to stand on a stage, hold his partner's hand, and say, "This is who I love." Not once, not ever. One of his sons would later say that Anthony left behind journals, letters, thoughts he never shared. Among them was one note unsigned, undated, that simply read, "Maybe one day, they'll forgive me for not being stronger." But it was never about strength. It was about survival. Anthony Perkins didn't die of AIDS. He died of silence. There was no grand resurrection for Anthony Perkins, no dramatic comeback, no final standing ovation. But in the years following his death, something else began to rise, something softer, deeper, and far more lasting the truth. In life, Anthony was never allowed to live authentically. But in death, he became a symbol not of horror, but of the quiet suffering so many endured in silence. The world that once demanded he hide slowly began to open its eyes. It started with those who loved him. Barry Berenson, his wife, never spoke publicly about his sexuality, but those close to her said she carried his memory with tenderness, not bitterness. She raised their two sons with dignity, teaching them to honor their father not just as a movie star, but as a complicated, gentle man who did his best in a cruel world. Tab Hunter, the man many believe was Anthony's great love, finally told his story. In 2005, he released a memoir, Tab Hunter Confidential, in which he confirmed their secret relationship. It wasn't tabloid gossip. It was heartbreakingly human. Two men, in love, doing what they had to do to survive in a world that wouldn't let them love out loud. Tab wrote of Anthony with deep affection. He spoke of stolen moments, of whispered laughter, of longing, but he also spoke of fear, the fear that eventually drove them apart, the fear that ruined so many beautiful things. For the LGBTQ+ community, Anthony Perkins became a quiet martyr, not because he chose to be, but because he had to be. He represented an entire generation of artists who were erased, closeted, or destroyed by an industry that only celebrated them when they were playing someone else. And yet, Anthony's influence endured. Actors like Neil Patrick Harris, Zachary Quinto, and even Timothée Chalamet, all men who now live openly, have cited Perkins as an inspiration. Not just for his roles, but for his vulnerability, his ability to make fragility masculine, his refusal to play the Hollywood hero in real life, and instead live in the complex space between. In 1996, 4 years after his death, the film Norman's Room was released at an LGBTQ+ film festival. It was a short, experimental tribute not to the killer in Psycho, but to the man who played him. It portrayed Norman not as a murderer, but as a metaphor, a man driven mad by the need to hide who he really was. In 2001, Anthony's son, Oz Perkins, stepped into the spotlight as a filmmaker. His work was strange, haunting, poetic echoes of his father's legacy in every frame. He never shied away from the past. Instead, he leaned into it. Through his films, he gave his father a second voice, one that could finally speak without fear. And then there was Barry. On September 11th, 2001, just 9 years after Anthony died, Barry Berenson boarded American Airlines Flight 11. She was headed home to Los Angeles after visiting family. She never made it. The plane was the first to hit the World Trade Center. She died instantly, her life ending in the same cruel, chaotic silence that had taken her husband. Two artists, two souls, both lost in moments that shocked the world, and both forever tied together by secrets, pain, and a love that tried, in its own broken way, to survive. But here's where the transformation truly begins, not in the characters Anthony played, but in the people he helped change, in the industry he helped challenge, in the lives he touched without ever knowing. Because Anthony Perkins didn't get the redemption arc in life, but in death, he helped be able to be a path for others to walk without shame. He was a man who lived in fear, but he helped build a world where others could live in truth. Today, more than 30 years after his death, Anthony Perkins is remembered not just as Norman Bates, but as a man whose life whispered truths that Hollywood tried to silence. He left behind two sons, Oz and Elvis, who have both embraced storytelling in their own ways through film, music, and art. Oz, now a respected director, has paid quiet homage to his father through haunting, dreamlike works that feel less like movies and more like memories brought to life. In every shadowy frame, there's a trace of Anthony, the tension, the sadness, the beauty of someone always trying to be seen without being exposed. Fans still visit Psycho, still marvel at the brilliance of a performance that redefined fear. But more and more, they ask deeper questions. Who was the man behind the performance? What did he carry that the world never saw? He never marched in pride parades, never gave speeches, never claimed his truth. But in his silence, Anthony Perkins became a symbol, a reminder of how many lived in the margins, performing perfection while dying inside, a symbol of the cost of pretending. His legacy lives in every actor who dares to play vulnerability as strength, in every queer artist who chooses to live out loud, in every viewer who watches his films and sees not a monster, but a man desperate to be free. He was brilliant. He was broken. He was beautiful. And even though he never got to say it himself, the world now says it for him. Anthony Perkins was loved, just as he was,